Hello. Welcome. All right, thanks for your patience. I'm Emily. I go by So Angry on Instagram and Twitter, though Instagram is where it's at. Twitter is just where I shitpost. All my panels are PG-13. If you didn't notice, my username is So Angry. That's my secret. I'm angry all the time. And we are going to be talking about how to sew cleanly and smoothly. I thought it was really funny. I got like 3 people who are like, wow, your Caitlin is so clean. I'm like, funny you should say that. Come to my panel. I'm going to tell you how. I have been cosplaying since 2008. I've been sewing for a little bit longer than that. I would just like do random projects in college. So I've worked on the crappiest little sewing machine you've ever seen up to some really fancy stuff. I've got 4 sewing machines now, but I started at the bottom and kind of just trial and error my way here. So I'm going to tell you some of the things that I've learned to do to make my sewing clean and tidy to satisfy my type A personality. This costume on the far left is one of my earliest costumes, and I got an award on that. I don't compete because it's just like way too much time, but I got an award at a costume contest for that for cleanest work, like technical ability. So that's my one peer-reviewed claim to fame for being a good at sewing. But why do you want to learn how to sew neatly? Why are we going to do that? You know, it looks good on Instagram. Like, why does it need to be tidier? Well, if you're going to compete, you're going to be judged on the cleanliness of your construction, and you will actually be awarded. There's a special award usually for like needlework or technical work. So if you're interested in competitions, you need that work to be clean. Also, if you just want to feel personally gratified by a job well done, that's me. You know, you don't really need a reason. You just want to. That's fine. Sometimes sewing cleanly can make it easier to get through the project. If the first part is nice and tidy, then it makes an easier space to work on the next part of it because mistakes add up. If you get frustrated with something because it doesn't look right, you may set it down and not pick it back up again. Also, you don't have to. You know, you just want to. It's fine. But we're going to talk about how to do it anyway. But this is a hobby, so you kind of decide your purpose with it. And part of my purpose is, you know, making something that looks really nice that I can be proud of, holding 3 inches from my face. So what we're going to talk about here, obviously increasing the tidiness of your sewing, machine stitching. I don't do a whole lot of hand sewing, so this is talking mainly about the machines. So hopefully everybody in here has used a sewing machine. This is kind of a beginner plus level class that I'm teaching here. So you've sewn something before, but you just want it to look a little nicer. It's basically a list of tips and advice that I've come up with, and we're going to talk about equipment, different techniques that I've found and learned from other people, the materials that will make it easier for you to do so. And if you have any questions about any of this, I don't actually know how long this is going to take me to get through. So hold your questions to the end, get your phones out, take notes, write that question down. Please come to me afterwards because I will really love to answer that question for you. So first things first, you're only really as good as your equipment, and all equipment are tools, so you don't need nice equipment, but it needs to work. How old is your sewing machine? When was the last time it was serviced? Do you know? What's the timing like? Is it off? Because if it's off, nothing you do is going to make it better. It needs to be serviced. Does it need to be oiled? What's the oiling schedule like? Has it been done? When was the last time you cleaned your bobbin casing lint? Did you put the race back in correctly? That's gotten me a couple times. And then also check your foot attachments. If you have different feet, you want to make sure you're choosing the right one. Here are some ones that I like to use to help make sewing easier, and the better it glides through the machine, the cleaner your stitches are going to be as well. The walking foot, I listed it last. There's a picture of it. Like legit, this walking foot stays on my machine like 99% of the time unless I'm doing something specialty like a rolled hem. I'm just using the walking foot. The walking foot is probably one of my #1 tools to getting the fabric to move through the machine cleanly, especially for knits. So if you don't have a walking foot, I highly recommend getting one. There are a bunch of different universal ones. You don't have to use Bernina. You can, whatever fits your machine is fine. A roller foot is also good, especially for things like leather and vinyl. It's a foot that just has like a little toothed roll on the top that helps it go through. And a Teflon foot, if you don't want to get either of those two, usually is in the kit of feet that you get with your machine. And you can swap that on there and it helps things glide through. So I want to talk about needles a little bit. Your needle choice is going to affect your stitch quality, because if you have a dull needle, a broken needle, a crappy needle, it's not going to go through the fabric properly, and then if it doesn't do that, it's not going to catch the thread on the bottom. If you're if you're using a leather needle for spandex, it's going to actually damage the fabric it goes through. So it's very tempting to just throw your universal needle on and go, go, go. Universal needles are fine for cotton. If you're going to make quilts, leave the universal needle on. But if you're going to be doing cosplay, your fabric is going to be who knows what. Probably stretch, probably some weird coating on it, probably an odd thickness. And you're going through multiple layers of different things. So, oops, let me go back. You want to make sure you match the needle to the project you're doing. Stretch needles are blunt tipped, and so that way they don't catch the elasticity of the fiber as it goes through. Denim are going to be real sharp and real stiff, and so that's going to be for any thick, like canvas denim, even like faux leather, things like that. Microtex needles, probably something you haven't heard of if you don't sew a lot. A Microtex needle is extremely sharp. My favorite use for Microtex needles are wet look spandex. So any kind of like spandex or any fabric that has a coating on it, it's really going to pierce right through it. And I actually use Microtex most of the time. I'm not sponsored, but Oregon Needle is my favorite brand. Schmetz, yeah, I got a nod over there. Schmetz is what you find in Joann's, but they break. And I did speak with Oregon. They interviewed me and they sent me a care package, and I used their needles and they were great. And I put the Schmetz that I had in my drawer back in my machine, and 3 of them broke immediately. And I'm just I got done with it real fast. And so I just switched to Oregon, and I've never looked back. It's the same with the thread, which I'm talking about next. High quality thread is important, and it doesn't need to be expensive thread. Like Gooderman is fine, and you can get that at Joann. But if your thread is fraying, or when you pull it out and you look at it and it's got that kind of fuzziness to it, where it's thicker, fuzzy in some spots and thinner in the other, that's bad thread. Throw that in the garbage. It's not going to go through the needle well. It's going to get to a weak point and break right at the moment you need it to not break. All-purpose is fine. It's going to work 95% of the time, but if you're doing anything specialty, you need to make sure that you're matching. If you're doing anything specialty that's going to require a different needle, you're going to want to make sure that the thread you're using matches the fabric and the needle. So your heavier stuff is going to use a thicker weight thread, and you're going to use a bigger needle with a bigger eye. If your thread is too large for the eye of the needle is going to burr the thread and break it. And if it's too thin for the eye of the needle, it's not going to loop right after it goes through the fabric. It's not in the scope of this talk to talk about which threads go with which needles. I really just want to point you in the direction. Oh, why is this not going through? Oh, well, I'm sewing, canvas, and I'm using my regular universal weight thread. Maybe I need to look into getting better threads, some thicker, upholstery thread, and that will work better, and put it in a denim needle. Other threads that you can use, like metallic and embroidery, also have specialty needles that go with them. So if you want to use a metallic thread, make sure you're using the appropriate needle that goes with it. And then this is kind of some advice that I think is kind of a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people. Fast stitching doesn't make you cool. You can go as slow as you need to. Unless you're doing this on commission and you have a job to do, in which case you shouldn't be here. You should already know what you're doing. Just go slow. Literally, that's one of my big secrets. I don't sew fast. I just take my time. Not all sewing machines have this, but there are speed regulators on some sewing machines. If your machine has one, just knock that bad boy down when you're doing something complicated or something that's giving you trouble. Just don't even allow yourself to get up to speed. You don't want to sew faster than you can course correct. So if you're going around a corner or you're doing something that's really important, don't go faster than you can catch yourself. If the needle goes down in a direction you don't want, stop. Back up that one stitch, start again. And you can only do that if you're going slow. And then other things that can make a difference is if you have selected the wrong stitch pattern for what you're doing. Everybody knows there's a stretch stitch on their machine and you should use it with stretchy fabrics, but check your manual. There may be different settings for that stitch that need to be adjusted at the same time. And tension settings that need to go with that stretch stitch. So when you do your stitch selection, you want to match it to the look that you want, but also to the fabric that you're using, and then make sure your machine settings match it. So just some things to check for. Here are some needle options for you. Again, I'm not an organ needle shill. I just really like their needles. But there's a lot of different options. And, you can really, there are some that are anti-glue. That's really cool. So if you're going to be doing stuff that there's that's sticky, or you want to glue some parts down and then sew on top of it, that's a really cool one. They make a titanium one. It's really strong if you break your needles a lot. Twin needles over there. We're going to talk about those later. Get yourself some assortment of twin needles. Something that a lot of people struggle with, and again, it's outside of the scope of this talk to tell you how to fix it, but one thing you need to consider is your tension settings on your machine. I love this little hand-drawn chart that I found online. I did steal all of these images using Google, but we're not being paid here, so I think it's fine. If your tension is wrong, your stitches are going to look bad no matter how straight they are. I mean, look how straight those seams are, but they still look like crap. So if you're getting wrinkled fabric, it's too tight. If there's looping, it's too loose, or your thread is not being threaded right. So usually the first thing I do, if it looks like the stuff on the left, is I'll take my threads out of my bobbin, out of the upper threading, and I'll rethread them and try again. And if it still looks like crap, I will check the tension. And you'll see this tug of war that your thread wants to play through the fabric. You want it to be an even match. Your bobbin thread tension should never be adjusted, unless you really super know what you're doing, which I'm not there yet either, but you're only going to adjust your top thread. Things that can affect the tension are going to be how many layers you're sewing through, how thick your fabric is, if you have batting. And something that a lot of people don't think about is if you have different thread in the top and the bottom. Obviously you want to use 2 different colors or whatever, but you didn't think to check, are they the same thread weight? If your upper thread weight is much thicker than your bobbin thread, your tension is going to be way off. You're going to have to really fiddle with the tension. So what I usually do is I get the threads that I want and I get some scrap fabric, and you just got to do a lot of tests. Just recreate what you're trying to do and test your tension. Trial and error is really the only solution for that, and checking your manual. And then, like I said, troubleshoot it, rethread, make sure that's not it. Make sure your needle isn't damaged or bent. That can affect it. Make sure your bobbin is set in there correctly. Sometimes you got to take the whole thing out and set it back in. But you could do a whole panel on tension, so we're not going to do that. All right, so this is the number one tip. I asked a lot of sewists, a lot of professional sewists, and I was like, tidy stitching. What's your advice? And this is the number one. When you sew, you're not watching the needle go through the fabric. You need to look at a reference. And what I mean by that is usually the edge of the fabric, if you're doing a seam, you want to look at the edge of the fabric and make sure that it is touching the same place on the needle plate the whole time it's going through, if your stitch is going to follow that line. If you are not sewing at the edge of the fabric, it's not a seam, you're doing top stitching, I like to make a reference guide on the fabric itself. If you can use a marking pen, like a fabric marking pen on the fabric, test the fabric first, then draw a line 5/8 inch or whatever to the left. Actually, what I usually do, whatever my presser foot is, I measure the distance. I get my seam gauge. Does everybody know what a seam gauge is? Okay. No? Okay. A seam gauge, do I have a picture of one? I don't think I do. A seam gauge is a piece of metal. I'm sure you've seen it, and it's got a little slider on one end, and it looks like a ruler. I'll find a picture and show you later. Or you can just Google seam gauge. And it basically is a way to check the depth of something at the edge of a fabric. And so it's a ruler, and there's a little slidey piece on it. And so you can set the slidey piece at the edge of your fabric or wherever your reference point is, and see how deep it is you want your stitch to be. And then you can make markings. So what I do is I take my seam gauge and I see how far away my needle is from the edge of whatever presser foot I'm using, and I create a seam guide on my fabric at that distance. So let's say my presser foot, my needle is here, and my presser foot is 3/8 of an inch at the edge from the needle. Then I draw a temporary line, or I use a piece of tape if it's a straight line, just tape it down, 3/8 of an inch to the right of the stitch that I want to make, and that's my new reference point. I'm going to put the fabric through, watching that the tape or the line is at the edge of my presser foot the whole time. So you always want to use a reference. And if anybody was confused about that, I actually have a video. There are specialty sewing feet also, if you didn't notice. There's a picture of one here where you can basically, like let's say you're top stitching and you want to top stitch an inch away from another seam or a stitch. That little thing has those lines. You can just line it up and watch it go. There's somebody using some tape as well. Lots of tools out there. Here's a video I found of someone using a rubber band as basically a seam marker instead of tape. And I thought that was really clever. I would just say the caveat is make sure that the tension of the rubber band is good enough, because if it's too loose, you're just going to push it out of the way when the fabric touches it. I find that to be the case with the magnetic ones too. I know that you can buy the magnetic seam guides, and they just move. I think tape is more durable. The rubber band could work if it's the right one, but I thought that was a neat idea. Nope, we're going to advance, not watch the video again. All right, tip number 2. Your tension is right. You've made your seam markings and everything, but it's still coming out wiggly because your reference is not reliable. You didn't cut it out the right way. It's not a smooth cut. So if I'm telling you to use the edge of your fabric as a guide along a line, the edge of your fabric needs to be as neat as possible. So use the tools available to you to accomplish it. Oh, hey, I do have a picture of a seam gauge. That's a seam gauge. Use the tools you have available to you to make sure that cut is correct, and to make sure that it is, you can use a seam gauge to check distance. Okay, did I put this marking 1 inch from the edge like I thought I did? And just use the seam gauge to check it. If it's straight, use a quilter's clear ruler to check that. There are variform curves. These are French curves. You can use those to kind of like draw a smooth line, or even cut a smooth line if you can find the right place for it to match up. And the reason this matters, especially if you're making a complicated garment, I don't think people realize it, is that like if you're off by like 1/8 of an inch and you've got 6 seams going around your body, that's going to add up to like an inch, at the end of the garment, and then it's not going to fit the way you want. So it's either not going to fit you because it's going to be too tight, or it's going to be baggier than you want. And fit is another thing that is judged in competition. So if you're going to compete, you need to make sure you're cutting where you want to cut in the smoothest way possible. And that means also having sharp scissors, sharp rotary blades. It's tempting to just like use that same rotary blade that's been on there for like 3 months, but as soon as it starts skipping stitches, if you have to press really hard using your rotary cutter, A, that's dangerous. B, you're just like gonna give yourself like a messy cut because you're really having to struggle through it. If you have to press really hard, change your rotary blade out. Sharp scissors make the best cuts and the safest cuts. Oh yeah, I've got a note down there about pattern weights. When you're cutting out a pattern, I like to use pattern weights over pins if I can, because when you've got the pattern down on the fabric, if you put the pin in, it just creates a little bit of a lump. And if it's close enough to the edge, that paper lump will mean you draw a line there that isn't smooth or straight. And then even as much as you're cutting as faithfully as you can along the line, it's not a straight line. So try to use pattern weights if you can. Use a rotary cutter and a hobby knife when you can. The hobby knife is good for like those little inset corners that you like just have to cut out like a piece of pie. If you have to use scissors, you can get good scissors. Good scissors can be sharpened, so you don't have to like buy new scissors all the time. And then use the angled ones. Don't just use any old scissors. They make specific fabric scissors, and they have that angle specifically so that you can lay the fabric on the table and cut with the fabric as flat as possible. So just make sure your blades are sharp and you're using the right tools. All right, here's another tip. If you don't do this, it is a game changer. If you're doing a curved seam, anybody who's taking my stitch practice workshop tomorrow, we're going to be doing some of this. If you do a curved seam, you need to clip out that excess fabric if your seam allowance is anything larger than like 1/4. So you want to make little triangle cutouts if you're going to turn the fabric, basically if the final shape is going to be like a neckline, like a U, because all that seam allowance is going to be bunched up together, so you need to remove some of it. And then if it's going to be like a moon, you need to cut slits in it so that it can spread out like a hand, like this. When you turn corners, you're going to cut them off at an angle, or you're going to clip in to the corner so that they can spread or bunch in a similar fashion. And then another way to get your seams to lay straight is to grade your seam allowances. I don't know how easy it is to see that photo, but like if you have bulky fabric or more than one layer, even if it's just 2 layers, I like to grade my seams, and that's basically cutting the seam allowances at different heights so that they kind of like lay smooth. Don't cut them all short, because that's just going to make a big chunky lump right at the bottom of the seam, but cut them all at different heights. And that's going to help when you turn it over, especially if it's being turned and flat. It'll lay nice and flat. Or even if it's going to be going around your body, it'll help it kind of like lay smoothly and not be super visible. I did this little thing here. When do you do this? Do you do it after stitching, or do you do it before stitching? And I think the answer to that is it depends. Usually you do it after you've made the stitch, but in some cases, like when you're doing a princess seam, and sometimes even a shoulder inset, it's like impossible to get the straight fabric to lay around the curve if you don't clip it first. And I talk about the best way to do that in a second, I think. Here's some more picture examples. You see how much smoother it is when you clip the seams. This one's unclipped. And then just clipping it makes it lay smooth. So yeah, iron as you go. That's the other tip. Sorry, literally at every step. I keep my iron like here. Like here's my sewing machine, and my iron is here. So I sew something, and then I move like this, and I iron it, and then I go back to sewing. You're even gonna like iron before you cut your pattern out. You're gonna iron that fabric because it came from the fabric store all folded up. I'm gonna be real, I don't pre-wash my fabric because none of my costumes are going in the washing machine. The only time I would pre-wash is if like it affects, like if there's sizing or it affects the hand, like washing it will make it softer or something. But yeah, I don't pre-wash, but I iron. You gotta iron the fabric first before you lay the because if there's like a crease in it and then you put your paper down, that line you're drawing is not gonna be straight. That cut you make is gonna be affected by that wrinkle. Iron your pattern paper. You know, a low dry heat, and make that lay flat because those come wrinkled too. You want to iron literally every new seam, I mean more or less, but iron every new seam that you make because if the seam you've just done is nice and flat and the shape it's supposed to be, it's going to make it easier for the next seam you sew. It's going to be easier to manage, especially if you're doing an intersection of some sort. Also, if you've sewn it, you can evaluate the success of that seam. Maybe you thought it's kind of crappy and you're like, oh, it looks like crap, I'm going to redo it. Well, don't seam rip it out yet. Press it first. And then maybe it looks okay and you can just move on. Or maybe you're like, okay, I'm ready to move on. I'm going to sew the next seam, and you didn't press it, but then it come to find out that seam looks like crap once you get it. It's not, you're trying to press it and it just won't lay smooth. It's bunched up over here. Maybe you got like a wrinkle in it. You want to press it out first to just make sure it's done right because you want to go ahead and redo it right then rather than moving on and like locking yourself into it. Pressing can also reduce waviness that happens, especially when you do stretch fabrics. You put it through the sewing machine or the serger, and it comes out looking like this. Where's the picture? There it is. Yeah. It comes out looking, you're like, oh, was my tension wrong? No, you just like press it and it looks fine. It also can reduce bulk when you're doing intersections or thick fabrics. I honestly don't remember why I put press open if necessary. Like, we can talk a little bit more about how to press, but you know, when you press a seam, press it flat, open one side, press that, flip it over, open the other side, press that, and then open the fabric and press the seam flat. It's like a 4-step process, but the results are really good. It's worth it. Here are some tools to make your ironing life easier. A tailor's ham or a tailor's roll or a sleeve board. I don't think you need a roll and a sleeve board. You could pick one. A sleeve board is actually really cool because you can do other stuff with it. But a tailor's ham is really indispensable. If you're doing curves of any kind, you need one. Glass head pins are great if you want to leave your pins in for whatever reason, like you've got another piece that is still attached that hasn't been sewn yet, so you don't melt your pins into your fabric. Press cloth for those fiddly, sensitive fabrics. Starch is a good way to make things lay flat and smooth too. I like to keep a misting bottle nearby because sometimes you have fabrics that, like, I don't know, they just, like if you get them a little bit wet, you know, you can get them to lay right. This is a clapper. I actually discovered the clapper while I was making this, and I'm going to buy one when I get home. Yeah, like it makes it can make a real big difference. Like you iron it, and then you get the board and you press it down, and it really makes it flat. Especially stuff like denim, stuff with a lot of body, make it lay flat. Oh yeah, there it is. Press flat, then in both directions. I knew I did that somewhere. Okay, here's write your question down, and I'll answer it later. Stabilizer is my other big secret. I brought some with me to the con. We're going to be using it in the workshop. My go-to for a smooth, even stitch is stabilizer pretty much every time. And you don't need to be super fancy or involved about it. This fuse and tear is like just under my sewing machine at all times, and I just pull it out. The roll is enormous. It'll last you like for years, and I just rip off a small piece, and I sew a little bit, and then carry on. I don't even fuse it all the time. The only time I would fuse it is if I'm working like with a really wibbly fabric and some like really aggressively stretchy fabrics, but I just put it on there and sew. Stabilizer will prevent warping of the fabric. It can prevent fabric getting sucked into the machine. It can help stop the differential between two differently stretchy fabrics. So you have one fabric with a lot of stretch and one with none. If you put the stabilizer on the stretchy fabric, you basically will keep it from moving and like moving out of place while you're trying to put it on the non-stretch fabric. It's also great for easily damaged fabrics. I will say, caveat, it's really only useful for straight stitch. If you do a zigzag stitch, getting the stabilizer back out is kind of a pain. It can be done, but they do make stabilizers that can stay in the seam if it's not going to affect the drape or the hand of your garment. So you could definitely look into that. There are wash-away stabilizers. There are liquid stabilizers. Starch is technically a liquid stabilizer. So you could use that in a pinch. When you're doing elastics, there are stabilizers that are meant to stay in the seam for durability and strength in high-stress seams. And then there are hem tapes, which are used for things like pant legs and stuff. These are all stabilizers. The difference between stabilizer and interfacing, does anybody know? What's the difference? You know, why are you even here? You know? There's some stabilizer that you can leave in. The real difference is stabilizer supports the stitch. Interfacing supports the fabric. So that's like how you decide what you need when you need it. But yeah, by and large, the stabilizer is going to come out. Like if you're doing embroidery, you'll use a wash-away stabilizer. Once it's done, you wash it away, and then you just have like this piece of lace, and it's cool. Anyway, definitely pick up some stabilizer and just like keep it near you. And just like if your stitches are not coming out even, put some stabilizer on it and watch the magic happen. All right, let's talk a little bit about top stitching. Top stitching is a nice way to make your garments look nice. So let's say you got this seam nice and straight, it's really smooth, but it just like still looks kind of homemade, and you just want to give it that extra polish. Top stitching is a thing that you can do to bring it that extra professional look. Because sometimes even ironing is not enough. This is actually my work here. That's my sparkly fingernail. This was a wet look spandex. It's actually from the Yaya Han wet look line, and it's just got so much body, like it's like a balloon. It just wants to like be bouncy and out, and it won't lay flat. And so I had this on a princess seam on a bra cup. So normally when you do stretch fabrics, it's going to be taut against a body, but in this case it wasn't. So I top stitched it with a very narrow zigzag stitch, the little lightning bolt looking one. And I think it turned out really nice. Top stitching is also good if you want to do some kind of contrasting element. And it can also be good for seams that have high lateral tension. You're going to put stress on it on either side of the seam to keep that seam together so you don't get spreading like this. Some tips about top stitching: you're going to need to use, you're going to need to use longer stitch slightly, not always, but usually I would say 3 or higher, because something tinier is going to actually kind of create a divot in the fabric, and I think a longer stitch just looks nicer. And like I told you guys earlier, you can use seams as guides rather than the edge of fabric. And the distance is basically whatever you want it to be, but just make sure you're looking at your reference that you've made and not at the needle going into the middle of the fabric. Using a twin needle is a cool tip for top stitching, but the same rules still apply. Use your reference to guide it through the machine. So some other helpful grab bag of actions: hand basting. I'm sorry. Hand basting can really help with things like adding zippers. If your fabric is really wibbly and uncooperative, you know, you can pin it first and then hand baste it in place and then get those pins out of the way, and then it will go through your machine a lot more easily and stay in place. Pinning is actually basting. I think I have a page about that. It's pin basting. But hand basting really is the only way to get things to look nice. You know, things like zippers and stuff. You'd be amazed at how much easier a zipper is if you hand baste it in first. Understitching is another thing that can make your stitching look nice. Let's say you have a hemline and you don't want to top stitch around it because it would kind of like ruin the vibe you want for it. If you understitch, hopefully this is really clear here, but that can make that edge look really crisp. You're essentially sewing, let's see, do I have a, whoop. You're essentially sewing your facing to your hem allowance, your seam allowance. I wish I had a better picture of it, but so let's say you sew your facing on and then you turn it. There's a sandwich of facing closest towards your body, then your seam allowance is in there, and then your final fabric is on the outside. If you stitch the seam allowance to your facing and then press under, you get this really nice smooth line at the top and a hidden, you know, semi-top stitch on the back. So that's just like something else you can do for the edges of your fabric. And then really the only other thing to do is just to practice a lot. Like fail a lot of times. It's not really failing, it's learning. Just do it again and again and again. I literally make 3 mock-ups every time I make anything. Kaylin had probably 4. And the more you do it, like you've done this mock-up, you've navigated this curve, you've navigated this corner. By the 3rd time, you know what to do, you know what makes it look crappy, and now you're going to do something better to treat it. So it's not just about fitment, but about literally practicing the process of the joints that you're making. So don't be afraid to fail, just do a lot of tests. Do every time you change settings on your machine, test it again, and do it a lot. All right, do we have time? We have, actually, I made great time, y'all. Let's ask questions. You have one.
Do you recall what specific fabric is better with a spritz of water?
So like wool, we'll lay a little bit flatter with water. I would do tests actually because some things like silk, if you put water on it, it will spot it, especially when you put heat on it. One thing that I like to do is actually kind of a cheat. When I'm putting interfacing on, I don't use a wet press cloth. I use the misting bottle to just like wet the back of the interfacing and then stick it down and then put the press cloth on top of that, dry, and it's just like less messy and less maintenance. Let me think about that too, because I do get it out, but like I would have to think about it. What's your question?
About pressing, what's the best way to clean the metal face of an iron?
There actually is iron cleaner, but I will tell you what you probably already have at home. Do you have a magic eraser? Magic eraser will clean the face of your iron real good. Yeah. Make sure it's cool first. Yeah. Dryer sheets?
Take a dryer sheet, lay it down, preferably on a towel, but just on the iron board.
Really? I'm going to try that one too. And then it smells great. Iron your dryer sheets, clean your iron, and refresh your craft room scent. Do I have any other questions? Yes.
So if you have a fabric that has like permanent creasing from being folded,
Okay.
is there a way to get that?
No, probably not. So the question is if you have a fabric that is permanently creased just because it sat in storage for so long, right? Or maybe like sun damage because it only ever saw the sun from that one side. There's not like an easy way to get that out. You're just going to have to cut around it. You could get like a seam presser, like they make these tools, seam creaser is what it's called, and you could try to like press it out, like heat it and press it with like the edge of the seam creaser. But I've been in that situation and I have not really had any luck getting it to come back out again. If there's some fabric that you like super love and you can't replace and there's like a really inconvenient crease in it, I think you're just going to have to maybe see if you can be creative about how you cut your fabric out. One tip I can give you then, if you have to cut around it and not pay attention to grain, interface it with a non-woven interfacing and essentially just change the nature of the fabric. That's what interfacing can do for you. If you find the fabric that you like really love, it's got the right color, the right texture, but I don't want it to be stretchy, I need it to be non-stretchy, interface it, just change the fabric. Your question.
Do you have a favorite kind of interfacing? Because I interfaced something once and then the interfacing came off.
So the question is if I have a favorite interfacing because you experienced interface failure. Yeah, that sucks, man, especially when you finish the garment all the way and you're like, wow, I've been there too. Which one did you use? Do you remember the brand?
I think it was one of the Pellon.
Yeah, Pellon is like got a captive market here, especially because Joanne sells it. Honestly, I don't have a favorite brand. I do use a lot of Pellon, but I think they're different products, have different qualities to them. And I typically use their Tri-Coat fusible, and it has a shelf life. You need to, it's not marked. There's not like an expiration date on it, but you should know how new it is. If you bought some fusible, and this is true of pretty much all fusibles, I'd say, that glue is not forever. Do a test scrap or whatever and try to pull on it. That's usually what I do. I'm like, how old is this interfacing? I don't remember when I bought it. I'll try to stick it to something and then like let it cool down, give it like an hour, and then try to pull it off. If I can pull it off, like I'm not going to use it. Or like stretch the crap out of it and see if it moves or peels at the corners. But yeah, the fusible interfacing has a shelf life. So like if it was like 3 years since you bought it, maybe just buy some new ones. It's not expensive. That's my best advice for fusible. You can also get interfacing that's not fusible. It's just sew-in. Like it doesn't have to be fusible. Any other questions? Great. We made great time. We can strike for the next panel. I can consider it panelists. But if you guys think of something after the fact, I can actually put this presentation, publicly, accessibly. Maybe I'll like post it on my Instagram a little bit later, and maybe also on my Twitter. He took my thing down, but it's so.angry on Instagram, but it's so_angry on Twitter. So whatever your favorite social media is, you can like check it out, and I'll try to post the presentation there. And then if you have any questions, you can message me there. But yeah, love to talk sewing and see your projects and see what you make with this knowledge, please let me know. Thank you for coming.